I have said before in my review of Tommysaurus Rex that Doug TenNapel's work usually is the most lacking as far as plot is concerned. I felt that Tommysaurus Rex, while very much an emotionally evocative work, it was a pretty simple story. Now there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, although some people do prefer to have some complexity in the works that they read. I find that a simple story can often be the most effective at times. The other TenNapel work I've read, other than the one I'm about to discuss, is The Iron West. It's been some time since I read that story, but I also felt it was a very fun ride, but didn't have much to offer in the way of plot. That brings us to Creature Tech, written and drawn by Doug TenNapel. Creature Tech is probably the most fun I've had reading something from Doug TenNapel. In fact, it's probably the most fun I've had reading a comic book in quite a while. The premise is as follows. Dr. Ong is a scientist in a small town, working in a research facility that stores supernatural and out-of-this-world objects. Dr. Ong is the son of the town's local preacher, and this brings him no small amount of discomfort. Ong doesn't like faith or belief in God, and he likes to antagonize his father about his own belief in God, even though both men share an interest in science. Ong believes you can only have one and not the other, while Ong's father believes they are very compatible and even complementary. Right off the bat, this is very engaging. Not to speak ill of Tommysaurus Rex, but that story was definitely more aimed at children than I feel this story is. And I'm not saying that this story is filled cover to cover with adult content. This story can certainly be read by a child with no problem. But I do feel like the themes this book has to offer are a little bit more complex than what we got in Tommysaurus Rex. Maybe I'm talking nonsense. After all, I'm a big proponent of not talking down to audiences, especially young audiences. If you want your audience to grow smarter, speak slightly above their level, and let them learn. So even though I, at first, thought this book was aimed at a different age group than Tommysaurus Rex, I do think that this book can and should be read by children, if only to give them something they can grow into, instead of something that will come down to them. Anyhow, this story isn't all philosophical pontification. There is a lot of fun, goofy action as well. The antagonist of this story is one Dr. Jameson, who, some 100 years before the story begins, tries to bring a frickin' enormous space eel to Earth. The space eel crashes into Jameson's house, killing him and the demon who he gave his hand to in exchange for help in conquering and getting his revenge on those who mocked him. In the present day, in the warehouse where Dr. Ong works, Jameson's ghost finds the Shroud of Turin, the fabric alleged to have covered Jesus Christ when he was dead, and Jameson's ghost uses it to resurrect his own body. Jameson's basic plan is to use the shroud to resurrect the dead eel, and use the eel to exact his revenge on the town and eventually the world. Now, this is the part where the plot and basic character motivations take a back seat for a moment. Jameson is our bad guy, and I've said before that the reasons why the bad guy does what he does are crucial in the structure of the story. In every superhero story, and I would categorize this as such, the villain makes the first move, and then the hero is spurred into action. So if the villain has motivations that we either cannot come to understand in any way over the course of the story, or they just don't make sense, then we have a problem. In the case of Creature Tech, this doesn't necessarily reflect poorly on Dr. Ong's character moments, but it does put the entire story in a bit of a negative light. After reading the whole book, I have no idea why Jameson is doing what he's doing. I guess I can understand bitterness overcoming a body to the point of wanting to throw everything away just to get revenge on those who tormented you. But Jameson's tormentors all died decades before this story even starts. Why does Jameson want to take his anger out on the world now in the present day? He has a fresh start. He can do anything with his life. And yes, while he does look like a vampire, that doesn't seem to be too much of an issue in this town. These people react to a 7-foot praying mantis as if it is the most ordinary thing they've seen. And while it's true that they are somewhat afraid of Dr. Ong when they find out he has an alien parasite on his chest, I feel like that is more because Ong just doesn't like the people of this town, and so they are reflecting his own feelings back toward him. I think if Jameson took his new lease on life seriously, he could have done anything he wanted. So why is he trying to destroy this town? Ultimately, I think it has to do with this story needing a bad guy so that Ong can be a good guy. So Jameson has to become that bad guy for reasons that don't entirely make sense. Dr. Ong's arc is maybe my favorite part of this whole book. Far too often in all kinds of media, I see any kind of religion or faith in a higher power ridiculed and laughed at. I don't think that every story should be a soapbox to preach a message of some kind, but I do feel like the balance is particularly out of whack, if you'll allow for a technical term. So it's very refreshing to see a book that genuinely tackles questions of faith, how to handle matters of faith if you can't see the evidence of it, or basically where these questions will take our protagonists. I do feel like Ong maybe arrived at where he is at by the end of the book because of seeing and not necessarily believing. Ong's father says that faith without seeing is important, and yet Ong sees proof that the Shroud of Turin works, and then he is shown something else which I won't spoil in the form of a vision. And it is what he sees in this vision that seems to restore his faith in a god of some kind. I am not dissing the end result of Ong's arc, but I do feel like he maybe got there in the wrong kind of way, if Ong's father is to be believed anyway. There are a few things about this book that I don't think entirely worked. How does Jameson know to kidnap the girl that Dr. Ong has fallen in love with? How is it that nobody in the town is aware that a giant space eel died on top of their town some 100 years previously? The eel seemed to be as long as a train, and yet nobody seems aware it even existed. But we see that Jameson's body was buried somewhere else when his ghost could easily access it, and Jameson was right under the eel when it crashed. Then you have the 7-foot bug named Blue, which is the source of some very funny moments, and one moment especially that I must have laughed at for 4 minutes. But I am not really sure if Blue is here for any reason other than to fill up page space while the other elements of the story percolate. And I have already mentioned my problems with Jameson's modus operandi as a villain, and Dr. Ong's arc and how he arrives from point A to point B. But overall, I found this book to be very impressive, both in how it handles the themes it is working with, how the art is presented, and everything else about this book. I would definitely recommend finding Creature Tech and giving it a read. Absolutely anyone who is interested in comic books or just fun science fiction stories should take a look at this story.